looking at your research, does that mean that it's just generally US corporations that misbehave?
My research is on a US sample. I could relatively confidently say that the social dominance dynamics that I see in my paper would generalize to other contexts. My hope for this research, I think the ideal outcome would be that policymakers should read it, right? Because this is a question of how do we hold corporations accountable in the real world?
Hello and welcome to PhD Hard Talk. Thank you so much for meeting with me today to discuss your research. Could you please introduce yourself and your research as well?
Of course. Thank you for having me. My name is Jeff Lees. I'm a visiting professor at Clemson University studying the psychology of why people believe in accurate things. And in particular, at the moment, I'm studying disinformation.
Okay, brilliant. I believe you sent us 2 articles, three, to have a read and to choose. So I've looked at all of them and I like 2. So would it be okay for us to touch on all 3? But the first one, I like is it SDO and businesses in terms of corporate misconduct? Because I thought that was really interesting in terms of where we are at the moment, in terms of sustainability and challenging corporations in terms of the decisions in the community worldwide. So that's why I wanted to pick that one. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. So could you please take us through what SDO stands for? Because I had no idea.
Absolutely. So SDO stands for social dominance orientation. So it's a measure of people's preferences for social dominance in a sort of political sense. So it measures people's preferences for group-based hierarchies and systems of oppression. It's a pretty overt scale. It asks questions like, are some groups, or I should say, it asks agreement with statements like some groups are simply inferior to others, some groups deserve more than others. And the theoretical framework is this idea that some people have a preference for hierarchy, right? Where some individuals, in particular some groups, have more resources and power than others. They see that as moral and okay. And the question is, people who see the world that way, who have this high preference for social dominance and social hierarchy, what are other correlates of their behavior and their worldview? So it's a consistently strong predictor of prejudice, interracial prejudice across multiple groups, right? So people high on this scale, in the United States, right, where the hierarchy is racial largely, right? They don't like Black people, they don't like LGBTQ people, they don't like immigrants. People high on this scale tend to be selfish and miserly, and just not very nice people. And it's used in the political psychology literature to predict things like prejudice and preferences for like authoritarian governments, things like that. And so what I was interested in was this question of, so how do people high in the scale react to corporate misconduct? Because we know a lot of people in the world seem, at least in my personal opinion, disturbingly comfortable with corporate misconduct, and so the question was, is this a psychological variable that predicts basically willingness to tolerate corporate misconduct? So are people high in the scale less likely to condemn really overt, unambiguous instances of corporate misconduct relative to people low in the scale? The answer is yes. And, as a psychologist, I had a more fundamental cognitive question of like, what's the sort of psychological mechanism underlying that relationship? It's somewhat straightforward, right? In the social dominance theory literature, there's this idea of hierarchy attenuating and hierarchy enhancing institutions, right? So hierarchy attenuating institutions are things like democratic institutions, human rights organizations, and hierarchy enhancing institutions are things like the police, and anything that sort of reinforces existing power structures. And corporations tend to be like that, especially for-profit corporations. And so it wasn't a bold prediction to say like people who like hierarchy enhancing institutions will also like corporations and be more lenient towards them when they engage in misconduct, especially when that misconduct flows down the social hierarchy. So we found that wasn't that surprising. What was surprising, however, was the psychological angle we took looking at corporate personhood. Right. So at least in sort of political discourse and legal discourse, corporate personhood is typically associated with people who are more pro-corporation. So people who we might be able to infer a little higher on SDO. They tend to argue legally that corporations should be considered people, should have rights more similar to people, etc. But what we found was the opposite. We found that people who are higher on SDO actually perceive organizations as being less human, less capable of human-like traits.
Mm-hmm.
And after a couple studies, what we figured out was the reason that this was, right? So there's a couple things that come with corporate personhood, right?
Right.
In the legal debate, those things come with rights, right? That's the whole idea of corporate personhood, give corporations the rights that people have. But also with rights comes responsibilities, right? The more of a true human you are, the more you are capable of agentic thought. That also means you should be held responsible for your behavior. And so what we find is that people high in SDO actually selectively dehumanize corporations in order to basically justify their moral behavior, right? Because if a corporation's a person, we hold people responsible for their immoral behavior, so we should hold corporations responsible for their moral behavior. And because of that, because the perception that an entity is human, therefore it has rights and responsibilities, in the context of overt corporate misconduct, they actually see corporations as less human, this sort of motivated cognition. They want to forgive corporations for engaging in bad behavior that flows down the social hierarchy, like harming workers, things like that. And so they selectively dehumanize corporations. They're less human. I'm less likely to attribute them human traits in this context.
Okay, so you've said a lot of things here. I mean, sounds really, really interesting. But I'm just interested in terms of how does your research help like a normal person like me? Because, I'm the one who's shopping. if I'm shopping, or I'm the one who's purchasing the software, if I'm buying the software, for example, how does it actually benefit me as a normal person in the world?
So, if my findings are true and robust, they haven't been peer reviewed yet, or they're under peer review right now, I should say, right? So if there would be two things I would say to the average person, one of which is my hope for this research. I think the ideal outcome would be that policymakers would read it, right? Because this is a question of how do we hold corporations accountable in the real world, right? And what are the countervailing forces that prevent corporations from being held accountable, right? And those are definitely institutional, right? There's a lot of legal, political institutions that shield corporations from accountability, but it's also psychological, right? I think if we agree that corporations need to be held more accountable, I think a fallacy that we often agree with, a fallacy that all people engage in is projection. We assume that everybody else agrees with us. So we might say something like, oh, the legal systems available to holding corporations accountable are broken. So when we say something like that, we're sort of assuming that everyone agrees with us. And one of the things my research hopefully shows is that that's not true. There are people out there who genuinely don't mind when corporations do certain bad things. And understanding their psychology can help us both understand how they could be convinced, which is not the focus of the research. The focus of the research is like just what are the psychological mechanisms that correlate with reduced condemnation of corporate misconduct. But the goal here is to say, we know that there's people who actually are comfortable with corporate misconduct. What do we know about them? What can we say about them? And what can that tell us about efforts to convince them and policy efforts more broadly? And I think that could also trickle down to the interpersonal level. So if you were speaking with somebody, right, and you find that they seem to be less discomforted by corporate misconduct, this could potentially give you some insight into why that's the case. What is the broader worldview that they hold that is contributing to this perception that corporate misconduct isn't that bad, and when it occurs, those corporations should not be held as accountable as others might think.
Okay, so I'm hearing what you're saying, but we need a balance in everything. We can't have everybody saying yes. We need a no group. So if we educate everybody, like you're saying, we want the policymakers to understand what is actually going on in terms of the corporates and also the people that believe that they're not human and therefore they shouldn't be held accountable for the actions that are made by humans. Wouldn't that just disbalance everything if we had everybody believing in the same thing?
So by imbalance, do you mean there's sort of this ironic conclusion that, people people who argue for greater, so there's a correlation in the real world between like people who argue for like greater punishment for corporations and greater restrictions on them, and who say that corporations shouldn't be considered people. So that correlation I think is true. And so my research might suggest an ironic effect here, where by lowering the perception that corporations are humans, we might also be lowering people's willingness to punish them. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I'm not suggesting. I'm just saying if we're willing to punish corporations willingly for their bad behaviors, right? We'll say, for example, they're not sustainable enough, they're not ethical, and everybody that's starting a business, for example, if your research was focused in terms of the US market, we say, okay, you're acting up, we're going to manage you effectively. They'll all file for bankruptcy, for example. They move everything to China. So when it comes to jobs, where are people going to work? Because it's the bigger corporations that act up the most, isn't it?
Oh, I see. I mean, my research is nowhere near the question. Like, that's a much more macro question. I don't have a good answer to that question, you know. I mean, one could argue, right, that if you strip a immoral organization of its ability to hire workers, right, market forces should kick in and other organizations should step in to fill that market gap. But you know, I'm not an economist, so I don't know what that would look like.
No, I'm just thinking, you know, and looking at the bigger picture to say, for example, if we take Microsoft and we say that this is just an example, and we say, do you know what, there are a few issues here. They employ a high proportion of, you know, indigenous workers and also migrant workers. So if they left, that means probably, maybe, this is just a number, 10,000 people out of work. So we have an SME that will pop up. They can only employ 10 people or 50 people. So effectively, if we're saying we need to work with the policymakers, for example, we've worked on the Equality Act in terms of women getting into employment, but we know with that, it's come with its own challenges. It can never be fair in that sense. So that's where I'm coming from to say, is that the right path for us to take? Because you're looking at it from a psychological perspective, and I'm now saying in terms of reality, we know that as human beings we can be devious. You know, if you tell me you need to drive at 50 miles per hour, I'll drive at 55 where I can, you know, do you get what I mean, and take, you know, the piss in that sense. So I'm just thinking out loud here to say, have you looked at it from that perspective, to which you've answered rightly so and said, you know, this is outside of my research. This is what I'm looking at. So no, that's perfectly fine. So in terms of one of the businesses that's mentioned in your research, is it Equifax? Is that how you say it? In terms
Equifax, of, oh yes. So in the introduction of this paper that we're talking about, I mentioned Equifax, as sort of a framing device. So frame listening, Equifax in 2017, it's a US-based firm that handles credit ratings in the United States, which means it has like incredibly sensitive information on most consumers, including their social security numbers. And it was hacked in 2017, releasing millions and millions of people's information. At the time, it was fined by Congress, the largest fine, I think, ever in this domain. I don't remember the specifics. But even then, at the time, there was still a debate of, right, like, there were multiple political debates because this was happening in Congress. There was the question of, like, is the fine enough? Is it really a deterrent? And then there was also broader questions, which, again, this is outside the scope of the paper. The broader questions were like this like too big to fail issue, right? If you have these massive corporations that have all this incredibly sensitive information about consumers, right, and they have this, they're really concentrated. There's basically 3 or 4 of those companies in the US that handle all credit ratings, these credit rating agencies, right? And if they're not taking their security seriously, that threatens the privacy of every American, right? And so that potentially, even though these are market actors, you know, maybe the government should step in to regulate it more. So that was sort of the debate. This was 2017, if I recall.
Yes, it is. Yeah. So how does one measure that they're not taking it seriously? Because you've just said that they're not taking it seriously. How do we measure? What's the tool that we use?
and I'll preface again by saying that this is not my area of expertise. I don't want to step outside my bounds. I think part of the question is that we just often don't know that these are private actors, right? They're private actors, and understandably and justifiably, there are a lot of legal mechanisms in place to allow corporations to, have trade secrets. Like they don't, they're not open books. But I think the argument among many of the critics, both political actors and industry actors, who are saying that like this fine doesn't go far enough, it doesn't serve as an effective incentive. A big part of that conversation was, right, we don't even know what these, we don't even know the security in place for these companies, right? We have a handful of companies who are effectively being charged with protecting some of the most sensitive information for basically every citizen. And we don't even have a good sense of how good their security is. It's difficult to even make the judgment of, is their security effective? Are they taking it seriously? Things like that. And so I think a lot of the debate was, right, is there room for regulation to make sure that these companies that hold a lot of sensitive information are doing their due diligence? The reason I brought that up in the paper is because, the bigger public debate was about the fine, right? Some multi-million-dollar fine. And one of the dependent variables in my paper were fines. Like how much should the companies that I use in my paper who engage in immoral behavior, how much should they be fined? Mm-hmm. So I use that as a framing device because that's part of my experimental paradigm.
Yeah. So in terms of fining, bringing it to relevant day, at this moment in time, we know that Facebook is in a bit of hot water, might I say. So, in terms of what you've worked on, do you think it would be applicable to Facebook in terms of current day and the whistleblowing that's going on?
That's a great question. So maybe, or rather, my work might explain why people might react in certain ways. So the version of the paper that you read is the most up-to-date public version, but I'm actively writing a new version where we have a new study. Okay. And so I mentioned earlier that, like the underlying theory of the psychology here is this preference for social hierarchy. And so in all the studies in the paper that you read, it's always, for-profit corporations engaging in behavior that reinforces existing social hierarchy. So like the harm caused flows down the hierarchy, right? It's corporations harming workers or innocent people who are less powerful than them. And so in the new study, what we show is that when you reverse that dynamic, when you actually show that it's identical behavior, so it does the same amount of harm or financial harm, but it flows up the hierarchy. So it's like a corporation harming another corporation or a more powerful corporation, or like, harming shareholders, right? So it's not harm that flows down the hierarchy. We completely flip our effects. So then what we find is that people high in SDO, people who have this preference for social hierarchy, they do a 180, right? The second that the harm is harming someone higher in the social hierarchy, they get very angry and that they're much more likely to condemn it. And people low in SDO, people who are more egalitarian, they're much more likely to be like, oh, this is okay. And so what that means, rather, I should put it this way, what that would predict is that reactions to Facebook, right, insofar as people think Facebook has caused harm, reactions to Facebook should be predicted by the extent to which people think that harm flows up or down the social hierarchy. So do people say, for example, Facebook is harming average people? Mm-hmm. Or do people say, Facebook is harming elites or conservatives? Mm-hmm. Or, and of course, like people might differ in that perception. But the prediction would be that judgment would then be a cause of the condemnation.
Okay, so I'm understanding what you're saying, but now I'm thinking to myself, the corporations that are causing us all these issues, positive or negative, are they all US corporations? A cultural thing that I'm now thinking from a psychological perspective, because in terms of the US, I've always been taught that it's an individualistic country in that sense, that everybody's out there to make their own money. So now I'm thinking, okay, looking at your research, does that mean that it's just generally US corporations that misbehave?
my research is on a US sample with like, in the paradigm is with US corporations. So yes. So the substantive question that you bring up is this question of how might my effect be contingent on culture?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. Let me think through this. There's a lot of research on SDO, right? So my paper, I think my paper does two things. Scientifically, it sort of bridges these two literatures. Like there's this literature on SDO, which is an older literature, which has been shown to replicate across the world. So SDO is a predictor of things like prejudice, authoritarianism, miserliness across the globe. That's an old literature. It's been around for a while.
Yeah.
The other literature, how people perceive corporate misconduct, is very nascent. In fact, like I found very few studies, like even the science of moral judgment, so moral psychology, and I would identify as a moral psychologist, is a very young field. It is very US focused, and it's very focused on individual judgments. So, you know, I could relatively confidently say that the social dominance dynamics that I see in my paper would generalize to other contexts. Question of like, what are the cultural norms and perceptions around corporate misconduct? I don't have an answer for that, and I don't think there's a lot of research on it. I think that would be a really interesting pursuit. And I'm trying to think through, because it's a good question. So like, you're right, and social scientists have long noted that there's variance in how individualistic versus collective cultures are and people are, and how might that interact with this dynamic. It's interesting. People high on SDO tend to be really individualistic.
Yeah.
They tend to be miserly and greedy, right? So they tend to like not play well.
I didn't want to say that because, you know, I'm in the UK.
Yeah. So there's not an intuitive answer to that question, but it's a very good question.
Yeah. I think we'd need to set that aside as a research topic on its own, isn't it? To find out what the actual response is. No, I mean, it sounds really interesting. I guess the next topic question that I wanted to ask is, how did you identify the research gap for you to go ahead and conduct your research?
This is not really a good answer, but it's sort of true. It's like this is a literature I identify with, right? Moral psychology was one of the things that really motivated me to go to get my PhD. And so like I'm knee deep in it. I know the literature, and I know what tends to be studied and what tends to not to be studied. And so sort of a lot of the stuff that I laid out for you. So I mentioned SDO, like that's its own thing. It's been in the political psych literature. It hasn't often carried over to the moral psych literature, but I was very familiar with it. The corporate personhood stuff, that the relationship between personhood perceptions and moral judgment is actually pretty well established. And so there were already these two pieces. There's this research on social dominance orientation, there's this research on dehumanization and how people attribute humanness to others and how that relates to moral judgment. And then I was interested in perceptions of corporate misconduct, and I was like, surely someone in moral psychology has done this, and it didn't take me long to figure out, no, there's very little research. No, and I think it's just because the field's nascent, because no one has taken the time to say, like, let's take these existing paradigms that we have to study individual judgments, right? So there's a ton of research on, like, if you did something bad, if you harmed someone, how I might perceive you, et cetera, et cetera. But then no one's taken it and said, how do these dynamics apply to corporate misconduct? Are they similar? Are they different? And so, this is one of the reasons perhaps that this research might sound basic in the scientific sense. It's just like, it's very descriptive. It's like, does X predict Y? Like, there's so much more to even be done, but no one has even asked. So it's really the start to what will hopefully be a longer line of research.
Yeah, I personally, I don't think it's basic. I think there's a lot to be understood when it comes to the corporate side, and also in terms of the culture of the country in which you're conducting the research in, because I think that plays an integral part in terms of how we reason and our judgment. So hence why I've been asking the questions that I've been asking, because those are the questions
Absolutely.
that came through when I read your paper. So I was really interested in finding out in terms of how does this one marry to that. My research is qualitative, so this is like my field. I'm excited. This is my thing in that sense. So in terms of a corporate misconduct, could you please explain what that is to the audience so that they know and they understand what it means to you in your papers?
So in my paper, I operationalized corporate misconduct in a very, very direct way, right? People read about instances of corporations doing things that harm people. And it's just like, it's very clear. They're very unambiguous. Like it's a pretty, there's not a lot of subtlety. That was somewhat intentional, right? It was just like, when you introduce that sort of subtlety, this sort of ambiguity of, right? So there's ambiguity in multiple ways. There's ambiguity in motives, right? So an unambiguous instance would be something like, corporation intentionally cut corners to save money and it caused predictable harm. That's pretty unambiguous versus like, was their intent to cause harm or were they careless? Was it really profit motive or was it something else? And then there's ambiguity in the harm, right? So there's like this definitely like, a bridge collapsed and people were killed, or, like people were poisoned. Like those are just unobjectionable or unambiguous harms. And so I could have introduced ambiguity on that end too. And that would be a useful follow-up study because that ambiguity is useful. But for our purposes, like we're asking this very straightforward question. And so we wanted a really straightforward design. Just like, here's an instance of just, there's no question that harm was caused, and there's no question that it was through, malfeasance or, a lack of effort, or often just intentional, like there was a bribe or things like that. So in that sense, it's sort of like in scientific terms, it's sort of a strong test, right? It's just like, if we don't find it in this context, we're not going to find it in the more subtle context. So can we even just can we just do like a basic proof of concept? This happens. And so we do find it. But in my paper, it's very overt corporate misconduct. I'm trying to remember the specific instances. It's been a while. Yeah.
My understanding is that you've done a legal test to understand in terms of what corporate misconduct might mean in different scenarios, and then you've narrowed it down to a simplified form for us to understand and to get to the end, basically, so that we can continue with the research. Is that key?
Yeah. I mean, it's really like, I think the better way to say it is like, there are instances where a for-profit corporation causes unambiguous harm. Like that's the operationalization, really.
Yeah.
So
just to be clear, in terms of the audience out there, this doesn't apply to non-profit organizations, and this research was conducted in the US. Just to make it clear, it didn't apply to China, it didn't apply to anywhere else, just the US.
The sample US populations and the just described organizations are relatively unspecified, but they're clearly would be like they would fit with the US corporation. Trying to remember, because we thought about the nonprofit angle, because it fits into this question of like hierarchy enhancing. Like a nonprofit is sort of definitionally a hierarchy attenuating organization. So that's where we want to sort of take the next step. We've shown that perceptions of their misconduct are affected by whether their misconduct like flows down the social hierarchy or flows up the social hierarchy, right? But they're still definitionally high on the hierarchy. So what happens when an organization low on the hierarchy does the same thing? How does that change perceptions? That is a direction that we're actively considering going, because you're absolutely right. Currently, all the judgments are towards for-profit corporations. And for me, I'm really interested in a lot of my other work focuses on this question of like, how do people think about group entities? So like a corporation is a group entity, governments are group entities, political parties are group entities. How do people reason about group entities? What traits do people ascribe to group entities? And in what ways is that similar and different from perceptions of individuals? And so my sort of scientific interests don't purely lie in for-profit corporations. And I'm in fact very interested in this question of how we make judgments differentially of groups based on other traits, like are they for-profit, are they non-for-profit, are they a political party, are they a government, are they a social group, things like that.
So in terms of the audience, what does group entity mean?
This is somewhat circular. Like group entity, for me, I'm interested in a cognitive perspective, right? So like a group entity is anything that is perceived as a group.
Yeah.
So there's like the sort of classic example is all you need is 3 people sitting at a dinner table in order for an observer to attribute some group status to them, right? So there are, you know, and what is perceived as a group is of course socially constructed, right? So like corporations are literally like, you know, it's literally a legal entity, but then there are also perceived groups, right? So there are perceived ethnic and racial groups, right? And who is included in those ethnic and racial groups changes over time. So there's not some like, you know, I don't put any sort of like I don't take like a realist point of view of this, like groups are things with clear boundaries that people sort of perceive. You know, the group status isn't of itself an attribution. Not to say that groups aren't real. Groups are real. Like a bunch of people get together and form coalitions to engage in different behaviors. And so part of the question, so the answer to your question is that is also part of the question. The question is, how do people think about groups? How do people define groups? What leads people to say, there is an ethnic group called white people, and it is a coherent ethnic group which has attributes X, Y, and Z and lacks attributes A, B, and C. You know, and why is that such a strong predictor of behavior, right? Like, you know, why do people who identify as strongly identify as white engage in certain behaviors versus people who don't strongly identify as white? So why does attachment and identity to certain groups drive behavior? I mean, these sorts of questions are really, these are the sort of questions that motivated the people who created my field, which is social psychology. You know, thinking about those questions, thinking about social identity. So.
Okay. So going back to your research, I mean, we've covered this just to make sure that it's clear, and I just want to know because I'm really nosy. In the near future, are you thinking of comparing NGOs and private corporations in terms of how, well, for profit and how they do function in that sense, and compare the findings using the same tool? Is that a thought process, or am I going too far?
No. That is exactly a next step that we're considering. So as you may know, of course, like it's not as easy as just like doing it. You know, money is a constraint, and so you know, the paper is currently under review. So a couple things could happen. It could get a revision, and so a common thing in my field is that a revision, a revise and resubmit, will ask for more data. So it's possible, if not likely, that a reviewer will come along and say, they'll have the exact perception that you have, which is an astute one, which is like, all your effects are with for-profit corporations. Do you think you'd see the same thing with non-profit corporations? Run that data, find out, and resubmit it. That's a very likely possibility. Another possibility is that the paper just gets accepted as is, and so then my co-authors and I have to decide, do we want to run that follow-up? Do we think it's worth it? Or, you know, not that it's not worth it, but, you know, there's a million things we could do. So then that becomes a question of our preferences. The paper could get rejected, and then we could choose to do that anyway. So it is definitely in the constellation of follow-up work.
Okay.
Whether or not we actually follow up on it will be contingent on a lot of things.
Okay, so to ask, in terms of your research, you found out that there are certain groups, isn't it, that are for profit corporations and their behaviors that think that's okay. They don't need to be challenged because they're not human anyway. Which group do you fall into as the scientist who's conducting this research?
Like me, like what would I score on the SEO scale? Pretty low, I would hope. I mean, I don't, you know, like SEO is one of those things where, you know, there are a lot of measures. There are a lot of psychological measures, personality measures, where like people high and low in those measures we can't, it would be, we should be hesitant to say like mean things about them. Like people who are high in extroversion are not inherently nicer, more moral people than people high in introversion, right?
Right.
SDO though, as someone who studies this, like people high in SDO are just sort of nasty people. And like the research shows this, they're racist, they're miserly, they're sexist, they're violent, or they're not themselves violent, but they support violence more. They're just not, it's like the gentleman who came up with this, the late Jim Sidanius, who was a professor at Harvard, passed away a couple months ago. He's a co-author on the paper. So I worked with him at Harvard. He has, I don't want to call him a pessimist, but he definitely, sees the world and he's somewhat grim in his worldviews occasionally. Although his worldviews can be pretty radical. He has a great book called Social Dominance, which he wrote to introduce this theory. So if you or anyone watching is really interested, that's a great place to start. Social Dominance by Felicia Prato and Jim Sidanius. So I would hope I'm low on SDO.
Which means you haven't done it. You haven't done the test.
I mean, I could do it, but I also I know what it's measuring. So I'm not or let me put it this way. The better test would, if you really wanted to know my level of SDO, the best way to do it would get my friends and family to rate me, because they're going to give it a better, they're going to be more honest than I am, and hopefully they say I'm low.
Well, that's a bit tricky because you're a scientist. You have to be honest and try your own tools on yourself, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I do.
You have to be 100% organic. So you have to try it and see what the truth is about you. You are conducting the research, but you have to be.
I mean, I have taken it solely because when I set it up in a survey, I have to go through it. So I've gone through as myself, and I rate myself pretty low. But of course, I'm biased because I know that the scale predicts things like being racist and prejudiced, and I don't want to see myself as those things. So I have self-serving biases that I know. I know in the abstract that probably bias my responses. I rate myself very low on the SDO scale, but I would hope that other people would rate me low as well.
Okay, no, that's perfectly fine. In terms of your research then, we've gone through your abstract and your research, and I'm just wondering, in terms of the next steps, if you were to advise your younger self when you were starting off in terms of research, what advice would you give yourself?
My younger self? So you mean right when I'm starting my PhD, or?
Yes, when you were starting your PhD.
That's tough, because in some respects, I'm pretty happy. I feel pretty blessed. I'm relatively happy about how my PhD turned out, and how I'm happy with my research. I like my research. I didn't have a lot of bad experiences. This might be a little nitpicky, but I mean, I would definitely say to folks, don't underestimate the importance of building a strong community in your program, right? You're there for 5 years. So this is not only with your advisor, with other faculty, with your advisor, with other faculty, and with other students. I'm perhaps pretty prototypical American. I'm very independent, and I approached it that way. I really just sort of hit the ground running. I did my own thing, and I don't inherently regret that, but in retrospect, I can see how my sort of desire to be really independent led me to not attend to social relationships that, looking back, I wish I had a better relationship with this faculty, or I wish I had a stronger friendship with my cohort mates. And so for anyone entering their PhD, really putting a deliberate effort into fostering and maintaining those relationships would be my advice, because it's really easy to finish your coursework and then go sit in the library for 3 years and write your dissertation and forget about all those things. That would be my advice. That's what I would tell my younger self, since I think I lean too heavily on the go at it alone worldview.
Yeah, I think I've done the same without thinking about it, to be honest. Just crack on and get the job done. Jobs are good. But in terms of the next step, so where do you see yourself in the next 5 years?
So I am currently a visiting professor. So I finished my PhD last year.
Yeah.
I'm in a grant-funded position, and the grant runs out at the end of this academic year. So I am currently on the job market looking for tenure track jobs. So the hope is that I will get one and I will move and settle down and finally feel like I'm settled.
Yes.
And like I have a place that's like I'm going to be from here for the rest of my life, rather than I'm moving every 2 or 3 years for different things. That's the hope. That's the goal. You know, I know it's hard to get these jobs. There's a not zero chance. I don't know how high that chance is, but I know it's not zero that I won't get a job. And then I'll try my hardest and maybe even take another year and try really hard again and not get a job, which would be a big disappointment. It wouldn't be the end of the world because people with their PhDs can get good jobs in industry.
Yeah.
So like I'm not globally concerned. Like I'm not concerned that I'm not going to be able to like put food on the table for my daughter. But it's just, you know, I have this very concrete career goal. And as you probably know, like academia is pretty whiplashy, right? You know, it's like you go where there are jobs, right? So I might want to live close to my family, but if I apply for 80 jobs and get one, and that one is in California, 3,000 miles from my parents and my siblings, like if that's my career goal, then that's where I have to, I put in quotes, have to go, right? So there's incredible amount of uncertainty, and that is like, it's psychologically stressful. But right now I'm on the market hoping that that'll be a success.
Okay, so would you be willing to go and work in Europe, for example, in Asia, or are you limiting yourself to the US?
Limiting myself to the US because my partner works in healthcare, and that's not really transferable. So she wouldn't be able to get a job basically in any place other than the US, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
So currently we're restricting ourselves to the US for that reason.
Okay, so shout out to everybody out there. Send the links over for job applications. We're taking and we're willing to attend the interviews, aren't we, Jeff? Well, I'll attend on your behalf if you can't make it. But no, all jokes aside, thank you so much for attending PhD Hard Talk today. Thank you so much for your time.
Of course, thank you for inviting me. This has been a pleasure.
Okay, brilliant. So to everybody out there, don't forget to share, like, and subscribe, and share the links to your aunties, uncles, cousins, nephews, your pets, your handbags, everybody. Please share. We need the views, and we love you, everybody. Thank you so much for your time.